on Blackboard. Can I see the CCJS majors in the room? Come on, be proud.
I guess me?
Yeah. Okay. We're kind of traditionally a bit out of temporal order, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to talk about bringing the perpetrator of the Holocaust to justice before we get all the way through our study. And we are very lucky to have, as our speaker today, a new colleague of ours in the School of Social Sciences, and that's Eric Williams. Professor Williams earned his BA from Lehigh University, which is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and a Ph.D. from Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He teaches courses in law and the politics of criminal justice. As far as his academic career, he has published articles on prisons, prison litigation, and the death penalty. And his research more generally looks at the intersection of politics and the criminal justice system. He's currently working on projects involving the effects of prisons on rural communities and the Belizean prison system. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Williams. Thanks. Have fun.
Anybody be horribly offended if I took my jacket off? That's all. I'm not really a suit guy as a rule. Everybody enjoy your day off yesterday? Thought it was very nice. The school decided to give everybody my birthday off. It was, so my brother called me last night and he asked what I was doing for my birthday, and I said, you know, normal birthday stuff. I'm reading about Nazi war atrocities and watching a video on concentration camps, you know, normal stuff. I have to admit, this is the second time in my life I've ever used PowerPoint while giving a presentation. It has a distinct advantage. Anyone who has had me in a class knows that I can't spell. I once misspelled excellent on a student's paper, and it only gets worse from there. So PowerPoint has spell check, so I kind of like it. I'm kind of excited to use it. On the other hand, I've never used it like in a lecture this size, so you'll have to struggle along with me in case I sort of have to go back and forth a little bit. I'm sort of the law nerd of the criminal justice department, and one of the areas that I'm interested in, despite the fact that it's not in my research, is the Holocaust and Nuremberg and the post-Tribunals. And so today I'm going to talk about, well, I had thought about talking about sort of the legacy of Nuremberg and international criminal courts, and then I realized that Nuremberg itself as a trial was something that most people didn't know a lot about. And so instead of going into, you know, a lot of sort of philosophical discussions about the legalities and justice and the morality, instead I decided that what I was going to focus on for the most part was how the trial itself came about, at least the major war crimes trial. I was going to tell the story of the trial, and then we were going to talk a little bit about some of the issues involved in the Nuremberg trials. If I go too fast, or if at any point in time you have any questions about anything I'm mentioning, please just raise your hand. I'm happy to stop and explain anything that I'm doing. There we go. All right. Essentially, the Nuremberg trials are actually 13 different trials held between 1946 and 1949. The major trial was convened by the US, British, French, and Soviets. It convicted major Nazi leaders who had survived World War II. There were another 12 cases that were held between 1946 and 1949. There was a major trial of the doctors. There were a lot of medical experiments that had taken place in Auschwitz and other places. The Einstockgruppen, who were the mobile killing units in Russia and Poland, were put on trial, lawyers, industrialists. So there were 12 separate trials after the major trial, which took place in 1946. I'm going to focus on the trial that took place in 1946. In 1943, actually, it sort of became obvious to most people that the Allies were going to win the war. And there were a series of meetings held between Stalin, Churchill, and FDR to start to discuss what they were going to do after the war, the war was won, what they were expecting of the Germans, what was going to take place. And one of the most important things that took place even before the war ends is the Moscow Declaration. And there's a lot that goes on in terms of what we were expecting of the Germans in terms of their surrender in the Moscow Declaration. But one of the things that comes out of the Moscow Declaration is this idea that the Nazis are going to be held accountable for their actions that take place during World War II. That there will be some sort of tribunal held. The hope is that the Nazis will sort of tone down some of their activities. That if the Nazis know that there are going to be trials, that they might stop what it is that they're doing. It's questionable as to whether or not even the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States and the United Kingdom knew the full extent of what it was, certainly of what it was that the Nazis were doing, but they certainly knew that the Nazis were doing horrific things, and they were hoping to slow things down. There was a lot of discussion amongst the three leaders as to what exactly they wanted to see done. And the three leaders really couldn't agree on what it was they wanted to see done, so they were very vague. One of the biggest discussions actually took place in Tehran between the three leaders as to what it was they wanted to see in terms of how to deal with the Nazis afterwards. And Joe Stalin, in sort of classic Stalin rhetoric, said what he wanted was show trials. He wanted to essentially line up 50 to 100,000 Nazis outside a door, run them through, find them all guilty, run them out the back and shoot them. That was exactly how Stalin thought that they should be dealt with. And no one was quite sure whether he was being sarcastic or not. Given what's been found out since about what Stalin did to his own people, he probably was not being sarcastic. And the idea that people should be tried was interesting to Churchill, who had never really thought about having trials. And rumor has it that Churchill, in sort of classic Churchill manner, sat back with his cigar and sort of chomped on it for a while, and he said, try these people. He said, I will try to give them a last cigarette and a blindfold before I shoot them. That was all Churchill thought they deserved. And what he actually wanted to do was take about the highest ranking officers, the top 50 to 100 Nazis, hold battlefield courts of inquiry. Not really trials per se. These courts of inquiry would just make sure that you had the right guy. And once you'd found that you had the right guy, you would shoot them within 6 hours. They would be within 6 hours. FDR wasn't sure what he wanted to do, because FDR was getting very varying sort of ideas from his cabinet as to what he should do. Henry Morgenthau, who was his Secretary of Treasury, came up with one idea called the Morgenthau Plan. And Morgenthau was very, very close to FDR. People said he was almost like a son to FDR. Morgenthau was also Jewish. He was horrified by the fact that the FDR administration had not immigrate when they had the chance to actually leave Germany. And he actually wanted to see Germany as a country cease to exist as it stood at that point in time. And one of the things he wanted to see was that big chunks of Germany be given to Poland, to Belgium, to France, that essentially Germany as it stood before the war would no longer exist, and there would be a tract of land that would be called Germany, but it would essentially just be an agricultural tract. They would for wine and very little else. They would not be allowed to arm, they would not be allowed to really do anything. And in terms of the leaders, he wanted to execute on the spot somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 of the top Nazi leaders. And he wanted to take every SS officer who had worked in the concentration camps and make them live in the concentration camps under the same sorts of conditions that they had made the Jews live in. Morgenthau found just it atrocious what the Nazis had done to his people. Henry Stimson, on the other hand, who was the Secretary of War, who had been the person who had been the leader in the FDR administration, stopping the Jews from coming into the United States, Stimson was a member of, he was a elitist. He was probably an anti-Semite in his way. He was much more concerned with this idea that the Germans had committed an aggressive war. He wanted to see some sort of way of stopping countries from committing aggressive wars in the future. And he thought the only way to do this was through some form of legalistic means. And so he was really pushing for some form of tribunal, much like the one that we ended up with. And Stimson really sort of was pushing for this. And so he ended up having an Army Chief of Staff named Murray Bernays put together a memo with a notion of how you might actually have a trial. And Bernays came up with a sort of two-pronged approach. The first was that you would have essentially a sort of a conspiracy theory, and you would try the Nazis in terms of the groups of Nazis that had done things wrong. So you would try the SS as a group. You would try the Einsatzgruppen as a group. That they were essentially a criminal conspiracy. That the Nazis were not a legal government in any form, and therefore they were like the mafia. You would try them as a criminal conspiracy. And in the same way that you would try each group as a criminal conspiracy, you could also try individuals who were a member as individual members as a part of that conspiracy. And the advantage of doing that was, you guys just read a chapter out of a book called Ordinary Men, okay? And in that it talks about a battalion of people who went and shot people. And it's one thing to put somebody on trial who actually pulled the trigger, right? You can take them to Poland, you can take them to Russia, you can put them on trial for murder, right? It's easy. You get witnesses, you get documents, you put them on trial, you put them in prison, you put them to death. It's a normal sort of proceeding. But what do you do with the person who started the ball rolling? What do you do with the person who comes up with the idea that leads to somebody starting a slave labor camp, that leads to horrific treatment of people, that leads to a gas chamber, that leads to mass murder? How do you try that person when there's no law in existence that they've broken? Well, you consider them a part of a conspiracy. You say, they started the ball rolling. They're guilty of breaking the law because they started the ball in motion. Or the ball started in motion and they kept it rolling. And this was sort of the brilliance of the Bernays plan. That you could try individuals who didn't necessarily pull the trigger and who didn't even necessarily give an order to kill anybody, because they were a part of this criminal conspiracy called the Nazis, or they were a part of the criminal conspiracy called the SS. Okay, the war ends, the Yalta Agreement is signed, Truman becomes president. Dachau being liberated by the US is an important moment. It's the first time that pictures of a concentration camp come back to the American public, okay? These pictures like this. These are pictures that we have become accustomed to a certain extent. In 1945, nobody had seen this before. The average American citizen had no idea what was going on in Germany. And when Dachau is liberated, we start to see the extent of what the Nazis had done. Okay, in 1945, it was decided that the Stimson Plan was actually the way to go. That we were a liberal society that believed in the rule of law, and that a legal tribunal of some sort would be the way to go. And in 1945, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson is appointed the U.S. Chief Prosecutor. And this is a really important moment because Jackson is sort of a lawyer's lawyer. Jackson is the only Supreme Court justice in the 20th century who never went to college. He passed the New York bar just by taking it. He was an incredibly successful lawyer. He ended up in FDR's cabinet. He ends up on the Supreme Court. He's a very good Supreme Court justice. And it guarantees that this is going to be a very legalistic tribunal. And the other advantage that the United States has in terms of having things go the way we want them to go is that the US has the majority of Nazis in their possession and the majority of documents in their possession. And so the US can sort of make things move the way they want to. Plus, we're the US, so we tend to do things that way anyway. In May, Germany unconditionally surrenders. In July, Jackson first visits Nuremberg and recommends the Palace of Justice as the site for the Nuremberg. Nuremberg is an incredibly symbolic place in the Nazi movement. It's a place where Hitler held some of his largest rallies. It's also the place, have they learned about the Nuremberg laws, which are the laws which essentially make Jews not citizens of Germany anymore. And make it illegal for Germans to marry Jews. It makes it illegal for Jews to own property. So Nuremberg is a very symbolic place, which is why Jackson really wants to hold there. And Nuremberg has been absolutely devastated by the Allies. I mean, it is just absolutely bombed into rubble. But as it turns out, this Palace of Justice, with this 1,200 cell prison behind it, has been left virtually untouched. And so this is where Robert Jackson decides that the trial should be held. Because Jackson wants he wants a huge spectacle. He wants something that the entire world is going to pay attention to. He wants something that the world is going to remember for afterwards. The London Agreement is very important. The London Agreement is where they actually draw up the indictment, and we'll talk about the charges in a minute. At the time of the London Agreement, there are now 4 powers that are involved in this. The French are considered one of the Allies. They're considered one of the victors. They have very little say in the trials, but they're at least showing up. The Soviets come still wanting the show trials. 50 to 100,000 people is still on the table for the Soviets. And Jackson really does want this sort of first trial where there's just a few of the biggest Nazi leaders who are going to be on trial. And so it's very important for him to get his way. And so what he does is he uses the leverage he's got, which is we've got the documents, we've got the Nazis, but he also gets Shawcross, who has already been appointed as the chief prosecutor for the United Kingdom. He gets him on board as well. Once the United States and the United Kingdom, who are arguably the biggest victors in World War II, are on board, the Soviets really have no choice but to get on board as well. France, throughout this entire time, they're kind of cranky. They never really get on board with any of it, but they take part in everything that goes on. And what they decide is that there's going to be some mix of a sort of British-American, an Anglo-Saxon system, and a continental system that they're going to use. We're an adversarial system. You've got a prosecutor, you've got a defense, and you've got a jury. Well, they decided we would use the prosecutor and a defense, but we're not going to have a jury. Instead, we'll have a panel of judges. Okay? And in October of 1945, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence from the United Kingdom is elected president of the International Military Tribunal, as it was come to be known. 24 men end up being indicted. 23 were actually held in the prison. One man, Martin Bormann, was actually tried in absentia. He was actually during the course of the trial. And on November 20th, 1945, the trials begin. All right, so the verdicts are handed down in October of 46. It was almost a year-long trial. 12 days later, all of the appeals are rejected. You can see that the appeals process took a long time. And on the 16th, 10 of the war criminals are hanged. And just after that, 12 more trials of almost 200 officials begin. All right, so let's talk about the charges a little bit. There are 4 charges, but they can be grouped into essentially 3 different categories. One is crimes against peace, which is essentially that Germany committed a war of aggression. That by attacking Poland and taking it over, by attacking Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they committed a war of aggression, thereby violating international treaties. The second one is that they committed war crimes being essentially their treatment of prisoners of war, British, American, French. The third, and the one for which the Nuremberg trials has become best known, is that the Nazis committed crimes against humanity, which is what we now know of as the Holocaust. Their treatment of the Jews, their treatment of the Gypsies, their treatment of the communists. Interestingly, this was, according to Jackson, according to the prosecutors, and Stimson and those who were really pushing for the trials, this was the least important part of the trial. They were least interested in charging for what the Nazis did to the Jews and the Gypsies. They were much more interested for trying them for what they did to Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which is sad when you think about it, but it's sort of the nature of the beast as far as the Americans were concerned. That it wasn't the mass murder of millions that the trial was about as far as they were concerned. It was committing a war of aggression that they were most concerned about. So, how did the defense end up in there? I'll go back to that. There are a couple of really big issues with these charges, okay? The first one is that the laws might be considered what are called ex post facto laws. Probably most of you have some concept of what this is. I teach con law, and in the Constitution, there's a section that says no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, and the right to habeas corpus should not be suspended. No one knows what a bill of attainder is. I'm sure none of you know what a bill of attainder is. People have some concept that there's something called habeas corpus because of Guantanamo Bay, so they've heard it on the news of late. Ex post facto, most of my students have some concept of, but not necessarily, so I thought I'd explain it for a second. The idea is this. Let's say California State Assembly actually could get something done and decides that they're going to pass a law. Much to my chagrin, they decide they're going to pass a law that says you cannot wear Red Sox shirts ever. And not only can you not wear Red Sox shirts, anyone who has ever worn a Red Sox shirt is going to spend 30 days in jail. Okay? So it's not just that from now on you have to stop wearing your Red Sox shirt. You can be arrested for the fact that you wore a Red Sox shirt today. This sort of bothers our inherent sense of fairness. To pass a law that isn't on the books at the time and to say, you broke the law when you did this before. Okay? When they passed this ruling about crimes against humanity, there was no treaty that ever mentioned crimes against humanity. There was no body of international law like we sort of have today. There was no statute on the books. There was nothing that existed that said you can't kill millions of people in a systematic fashion. It's horrible to think, but there really was no law necessarily that the Nazis were breaking by doing what they were doing. First of all, in terms of their own citizens, there really is no law in the book that says you can't murder your own citizens, sad enough. And in terms of other countries, they were at war. And they could consider that this was just an act of war. So in essence, they were passing a law that didn't exist and saying, you broke a law that didn't exist at the time you broke it. And this was troubling for a lot of people. And in fact, as a law, the prosecutor who took over after Robert Jackson only did the one big trial. And then he left it to a guy named Telford Taylor to prosecute the rest of the trials. Telford Taylor admits over and over again in several books, yeah, this was an ex post facto law. Yeah, sorry. What are you going to do? And the justification that they could come up with was that every state essentially has laws against murder. And since every civilized society has laws against murder, the entire body of international law somehow finds murder to be illegal. Another problem is this idea of individuals being held accountable for the actions of a state. In terms of the committing a war of aggression, the crimes against peace charge, the treaties that existed up until then, there was the Hague Convention, there was the Treaties of Paris, there was the First Treaty, there was some body of international law that said, hey, you can't commit these aggressive crimes, these aggressive wars. But they said that a state can't commit these aggressive wars. There was nothing on the books that said individuals can't take part in the state committing these aggressive wars. At most, you could charge Hitler with that. Hitler was the leader of the country. He was the one who was actually giving the orders. He was the one who was actually committing this aggressive war. That wasn't who was being charged with this. 23 other people who were being charged with this. Hitler was dead. So this was troubling as well, because there was no body of international law that said you can charge individuals as a conspiracy. Okay? The other problem is number two, is this idea that you could have a defense that says I was just following orders. In British and American courts, if a soldier is charged with a crime, and it was a legally given order that the crime was conducted under, it is a legally valid defense to say, I was just following orders. So there's this huge body of law in both Britain and the United States that says it's an absolute defense to committing a war crime to say, I was just following orders. And the London Agreement specifically said that Nazis could not say, as a defense to their actions, man, just following orders. That was not okay. The other thing the London Agreement said as what was not an okay defense is what's called in law tu quoque, which means you did it too, in essence. America was not always wonderful during World War II. The Nazis couldn't point to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as being mass murders that were unnecessary. They couldn't to the United States and say, you've committed aggressive wars as well. The Nazis were not allowed this as a defense. They couldn't say, you did it. We did it, sure, we were wrong, but you did it too. Those defenses were closed off to them. And some legal experts have had problems with these. The other thing, in order to make the defense more fair, the London Agreements allowed the Nazis to have any lawyer they chose. And this got a little troubling because most of the best lawyers in me were actually Nazi party members. And you were now giving access to some of our documents that were secretive to former Nazis. But they decided at the end of the day that this was something you had to allow them to do. And so most of the defendants were actually represented by former party members. All right. Lord Geoffrey Lawrence was the chief judge. Geoffrey Lawrence was an interesting choice as the chief judge. Francis Biddle, who was the American main judge, he deserved this gig. And he was really upset that he didn't get it. But Robert Jackson sort of twisted his arm and convinced him that it would be way too much American influence if he was the main judge. But Biddle wasn't the only person who was upset that Geoffrey Lawrence got this job. Norman Burkitt, who was the most famous lawyer in Britain at the time, was originally offered the job as British main judge. And then somebody in Parliament said, you know what, the main judge has to be a member of the House of Lords, and they took the job back from Burkitt. And Burkitt never got over it. For the rest of his life, he was upset about it. And so Geoffrey Lawrence ends up as the chief judge, and he was really not a very distinguished lawyer. He was really not a distinguished judge. as it turns out, he ran the proceeding in an unbelievably fair manner. And if there's one thing you can say about him is that he really did give the defendants a chance to defend themselves as much as they could have. These are the other main judges. Francis Biddle had been the Attorney General of the United States. I know there are a lot of names. It's the PowerPoint. Major General Nichenko, that's my Russian for you, is the Soviet main judge. He actually ended up being very close with Biddle. He became famous later for prosecuting an American pilot who he was spying on the Soviet Union and ended up crashing. And he spent an awful lot of time on the phone with Stalin trying to decide how he should judge each of the criminals. But he ended up being very close with Biddle. The French judge really didn't have much to do with anything. The French were there in name only for the most part. The alternate judges did basically nothing except complain. They complained about their quarters not being as the main judges. They complained because when they saw the courtroom, their chairs weren't as nice as the main judges. They complained that they weren't getting a vote like the main judges. All they did was complain. Robert Jackson had it with the alternate judges by the end of this trial because he was the one who heard all of the complaints, and he had just had it with every single one of them. The prosecutors, Robert Jackson, I've talked about quite a bit. Sir Hartley Shawcross. Jackson is the most well-known of the group of prosecutors. He's also the most well-quoted. He gave the opening and closing statements. Most journalists who actually watched the trial say Shawcross was actually the most devastating of all of the attorneys. He cross-examined several of the Nazi defendants and absolutely ripheads. Jackson was not particularly good in terms of cross-examining the witnesses. He had been a judge for a long time. It had been a long time since he had actually been a trial attorney. Rudenko, similarly to the Soviet judge, spent an awful lot of time on the phone with Stalin discussing how he should go about things. The French actually had two prosecutors who, again, kind of just showed up. This is one of the famous quotes from Jackson's opening statement. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. The reason I put this quote up there is it's one of the most quoted moments from his opening statement, and it would make it sound like it was the mass murder of millions of people that were on trial here. But when you see the actual documentary evidence, and when you see the way the trial actually took place, it really was a trial about the aggressive war that Germany carried out, which is sort of the sad part of the whole thing. These are the defendants actually sitting in the dock on trial. Hermann Goering was sort of he was the prize. He was the highest-ranking Nazi who stood trial at Nuremberg. This is actually probably the best picture of him I've ever seen, which is sad and frightening. Goering was a really fascinating character, sort of the clown prince of the Nazi regime. He was 5'6", about 300 pounds. He changed clothes 3 or 4 times a day. He had these outfits. They weren't even uniforms. They were outfits that were made for him that were bright blue. He would wear these Bavarian hunting outfits with like feathers sticking out of his cap. And people kind of thought he was a clown, and they thought that he wasn't to be taken seriously. He was the second in command. Hitler said that if anything were to ever happen to him, that Goering was to take over. He was also seriously addicted to morphine. When he turned himself over to the Americans, 7 suitcases, one of them contained 4,000 morphine pills. So they took that away from him. As it turned out, when he got off the drugs, he was unbelievably sharp. And he turned out to be sort of Robert Jackson's nightmare. Up on the witness stand, he was somewhat devastating to Jackson's case a lot of the time. Rudolf Hess was the third in command at one point in time. Hess is also a fascinating figure. Hess in 1941 flew a plane and flew to Scotland and tried to negotiate his own peace treaty. He asked to see the Duke of Hamilton and said that essentially that England was going to lose the war and that they should make a treaty with the Germans right there so that the Germans only had to go and fight the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, were way worse than the Germans could ever be. You should worry about the communists, not the Nazis. And Hess essentially sat out most of the war in an English POW camp. And it was, despite his rank in the party, he was taking all that seriously. And most people are surprised that he was put on trial in the major war crimes trial. It was really the Soviet Union that hated him because he was trying to sell them out by making this treaty with the United Kingdom. And after he did his nutty flight in the middle of the night to Scotland, Hitler didn't quite know how to deal with him. He was in England already, and so he said, I don't know, Hess is crazy. And so Hess decided, well, if Hitler says I'm crazy, I'm crazy. And so he started acting crazy, and he claimed amnesia. And so from 1941 to 1945, he claimed to have amnesia. He said he didn't remember anything. He didn't remember his wife, he didn't remember his kids. He wrote his wife letters every day. But he claimed that he was just copying her name from the letters that he was receiving. He met Goering in prison, and he said he didn't remember him. And his defense was essentially that he was insane. And we'll talk about that actually a little bit later. Von Ribbentrop was the German minister, and he was, in some ways, he was the face of Germany to the world. He had met with Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister before the war, and made a treaty with him, a non-aggression treaty, which Germany then broke. He then made a treaty with Stalin, saying that essentially that the Russians would not, that if Germany invaded Poland, that the Russians wouldn't stop them, as long as the Germans didn't then invade the Soviet Union. The Germans, of course, then broke that. And Ribbentrop, he sort of claimed he was just sort of following Hitler's orders. He spent most of his time at cocktail parties talking with the press, but he was very much the face of Germany to the West throughout most of the war. Julius Streicher is kind of both despicable and tragic all at the same time. He was the editor of Der Stürmer, which was sort of a tabloid newspaper, which used to publish all of these anti-Semitic. He also was stupid, and at one point in time published an article claiming that Goering was impotent and that his child wasn't his own, it was actually somebody else's, and that didn't go over very well with Goering, and Goering had him, all but thrown out of the party at that point. They tested his IQ while he was awaiting trial, and he tested at 107, which is kind of considered dull normal, I guess. Really, the reason Streicher was there was because he was kind of a despicable human being, and he was kind of the stand-in for Goebbels, who was the propaganda master of the Nazis. And because Goebbels had killed himself, they couldn't have him, so they had Streicher instead. This is Hans Frank. He was the Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. He was referred to as the Jew Butcher of Krakow. We'll talk about Frank a little bit more later. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, he was sort of the Nazi central casting. The reporters who were reporting on the trial loved him because he looked like a Nazi should look, they thought. He was about 6'3". He had this very menacing look, despite the goofy grin on his face in the picture I chose. You can kind of see the scar across his face. It was sort of huge and purple, and so the press used to sort of say, well, we wonder from, like, what war battle did this come from, who hit him? It turns out he was drunk one night in his car and he hit a tree. So it really wasn't that exciting. He ended up sort of being the stand-in for Himmler, who was the head of the SS, the head of the Gestapo, and because he had killed himself also, he was the best we could do. These are some of the other defendants. Hans Fritsch is the head of the radio division. He was basically a guy who he was a radio reporter. He had a lot of really horrible anti-Semitic things, but he was kind of the Rush Limbaugh of Nazi Germany. He was really not much better and not much worse than him, but he was he was in propaganda ministry, so he ended up on trial. Alfred Jodl and William Keitel were essentially the military heads that we put on trial. They were the chief of operations and the chief of staff of the German High Command. More defendants. Alfred Rosenberg was essentially the chief Nazi philosopher. He was supposed to take their anti-Semitic ideas and turn them into an understandable philosophy. And he ended up becoming the Reich minister for the Eastern Occupied Territories because he was so good at his job. Sokal and Speer. Speer was essentially Sokal's boss. Speer was the head of armaments, which doesn't all of that bad of a job, but essentially it was Speer's job to decide how many slaves were needed to get as many armaments as the Germans needed to fight the war, and it was Sokal's job to actually get the slaves. So they were very closely related. Sokal was not much smarter than Julius Streicher, and also, to his disturbing credit, he had the bad Hitler mustache. Essentially, there was a sort of typology of defendants that they had. They had the high-ranking Nazis, the Goerings and the Hesses. They were going to be the stand-ins for Hitler. We didn't have Hitler. Hitler had killed himself, so we had Goering and we had Hess. The high military command, Jodl and Keitel, they were the military leaders of Nazi Germany. The slave laborers, Speer and Sokal, which I talked about earlier. Rosenberg, Streicher, they were essentially the propagandists. We didn't have Goebbels, so they were the best we were going to do. And we had the henchmen. We had Frank, who was the Jew butcher of Krakow, and Kaltenbrunner, who was one of the leaders of the Gestapo. We also had a group of capitalists. We had the head of the Reichsbank, who said he was nothing but sort of a bank clerk. But that included, being a bank clerk in those days included taking the gold from Jews' teeth. The prosecution's case. Essentially, Robert Jackson decided what he was going to do was he was going to put on a documentary case. He had truckloads of documents. The Germans were meticulous. They took notes on everything. They wrote everything out. Every order was on paper. They had just truckloads and rooms full of documents, more documents than they even knew what to do with. And Jackson was just going to sit up there and destroy them with the documentary evidence. There's a small problem with that. And the biggest problem with that is that it's boring. And he wanted this trial to be this sort of great moment in world jurisprudence, and he was boring the world press. And so after a while, the case sort of became bogged. Journalists sort of stopped showing up, and after a while, the other prosecutors started to argue that they needed to do something. They needed to sort of liven things up a little bit. And so one of the things that they started doing was they started bringing in more witnesses against the defendants, and they started showing films. And one film blew up in their face, and one film was absolutely devastating to the defendants. They showed both films in one day. In the morning, they showed a film which was called Nazi Propaganda Machine. And this was essentially a film about the Nazi propaganda machine. And it showed Hitler's, it showed the rallies, and the defendants got all riled up. They got very excited. Hess at one point turned to Goebbels Goering and said, "You'll be the Fuhrer again. This is going to excite everybody. Even Jackson will end up being a Nazi because of this movie." And it kind of blew up in Jackson's face. In the afternoon, they ended up showing a film called Nazi Concentration Camps. And this was really the first time the world had seen in great detail Dachau and Buchenwald were where these films had taken place. And they were horrifying. They were horrifying. There were other moments. The warden of a prison camp at Dachau had a shrunken Jewish man's head. he used as a paperweight. And Chris Dodd's father, one of the prosecutors, came in one day with it and put it out in front of him and used it as sort of a showpiece as he was questioning one of the witnesses. And so they finally realized that they needed to use the atrocities Nazis had done against the Jews and the Gypsies to really sort of show people how bad they were. That documentary evidence that they had invaded Poland and that it had been a war of aggression wasn't really convincing anyone as to how bad the Nazis were. The defense essentially went several different ways. Goering was actually several of them were, but Goering was the most so. He was defiant. Jeffrey Lawrence decided that he was going to be fair to a fault, and he allowed Goering as much latitude as he wanted when it was his turn to talk in his own defense. He rambled on for nearly 2 days, discussing why it was the Nazis were a necessary evil, why it was the Nazis had gone about what they did, how it was Hitler had sort of convinced them to go about what they did. And Goering essentially did a phenomenal job. Goering was exceptionally bright. And when it came time for the cross-examination, the press was exceptionally excited. Like, this was going to be the great moment. It was going to be Jackson versus Goering, good against evil. And as it turns out, Jackson really wasn't up to the task. And he set all of these traps for Goering, and Goering didn't fall into any of them. And it was sort of like the press sort of went in there very excited and left there kind of like, huh. Hess claimed insanity. I told you about the end that he claimed. He claimed to have amnesia. He actually fooled a panel of 12 psychiatrists that were brought in, claiming he had amnesia. And finally, the court decided that they had to rule on whether or not he was even competent to stand trial. And the day that they were making the ruling, there was a psychologist who had been meeting with Hess a lot. And what he went up to Hess and he said to Hess, he goes, look, if they rule that you're incompetent to stand trial, you're not going to be able to come to the court anymore. And all of the sudden stood up straight, and he realized that he wasn't going to be able to spend any time with his friends. And he stopped the proceeding right there and made a pronouncement that he wasn't insane, that it all had been a ploy, that he knew perfectly well what was going on, and that they should stop the proceeding right there. So he wasn't insane. It was all an act. There were Nazis who were repentant. Speer was one of them who claimed to be repentant. There's arguments about whether he really was. Hans Frank actually, I think, was. Frank was rebaptized in Catholicism while he was in jail. Supposedly he needed heavy doses of sleeping pills at night to sleep. Yeah.
Wasn't that the Jew butcher?
Yes. So, go figure. He was very repentant. He actually, when he put on his defense, he got up there and said Nazism was wrong. They were wrong for what they did. He decried what it was that he did in Poland. Speer was kind of a cagey guy. Speer was brilliant. Speer was an engineer and an architect, and he did much of the same thing. He essentially said that what they had done was wrong, and also said that he really didn't know what they were doing with the laborers that he was getting. He never called them slaves. He just said that they were laborers. There was the military men, Keitel and Jodl and the others, essentially did use the defense of we were following orders. They said we were in the military. Hitler gave the orders and we carried them out. We knew exactly what would happen if we failed to carry them out. We would either be killed or we would be sacked. And we didn't want either of those things to happen. We had no choice. He was the one who gathered slaves. He claimed that he treated his slaves very well. And he claimed to have no knowledge of how they were treated after he gathered them. Ribbentrop also claimed that he was out of the country most of the time, and how could he be held responsible for what was going on inside of Germany. The other thing that almost all of them did was they blamed Hitler, they blamed Himmler, they blamed Goebbels, all of who had killed themselves at this point in time, and they blamed Eichmann, who all of them thought was dead. Eichmann was actually alive and in Argentina. So that was the other way that they decided to go about things. The verdicts. After all of this, the verdicts came down. Essentially, the verdicts took 3 days to read. The first verdicts actually were just about the fact that the Nazis had indeed committed aggressive war, these indeed were legal proceedings under the Hague Conventions, the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Paris. The second day was spent going through the various groups and deciding the guilt of the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, the Gestapo, and then they passed judgment on the individual defendants. 11 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 of the defendants were acquitted altogether, and the rest of them get prison terms from anywhere from 10 years to. So what is the legacy of Nuremberg? As I said, there were 12 other war crimes trials that took place in Nuremberg from 46 to 49. There were actually more planned, but the then Chancellor of Germany said essentially that the German people had had enough, and could they please stop? And at the time, we had begun the Cold War with the Soviet Union, so we weren't getting along very well with them. And we needed the Germans on our side, and so we gave in and stopped holding trials. Eventually, Israel became a state during this time. Part of the first Israeli Constitution said that essentially the only thing that is a capital crime in Israel is being a Nazi war criminal. It is the only crime that is punishable by death in Israel. And Israel decided that essentially Nuremberg was a sham, that it was all about the war of aggression, and that they were going to hold their own trials. And one of the trials that they held was the trial of Adolf Eichmann. And if you ever get a chance, it's a fascinating story. They ended up finding Eichmann in Argentina. In the middle of the night, they end up kidnapping him, taking him back to Israel, putting him on trial, and he ended up being sentenced to death. There were later trials in Germany for what had happened in Dachau and Auschwitz. It took until 1992, but there were other war crimes tribunals for genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda. In 2003, there was the creation of the International Criminal Court. In 2002, I'm sorry. And as of last week, we may have an indictment of the Sudanese president, Bashir, for what's gone on in Darfur. There's some question as to whether that's going to be put off or not. So what were the lessons of Nuremberg? Essentially, there was the creation of there was now such a thing as crimes against humanity. There was also a question, the idea that you couldn't say, well, you did it too, that there was an idea that this was sort of victor's justice. And that was problematic. And one of the things the International Criminal Court has done, it has brought a completely neutral body to have these criminal trials for war crimes. Unfortunately, there's been a lack of worldwide support for the International Criminal Court. The United States, for example, has not signed on. We're willing to sign on to it as long as United States soldiers are never brought before it. Russia feels the same way. Japan feels the same way. So we're fine with an International Criminal Court as long as only everybody else is actually charged with crimes. We still haven't decided what the point is of war crimes tribunals altogether. The arguments are that these tribunals are supposed to build a sturdy peace, that they're supposed to purge enemy leaders, that they're supposed to deter other war criminals, that they're supposed to rehab former enemy countries, that they place the blame on individual countries as a whole, that they end up being essentially truth tribunals, that we learn what really happened behind the scenes. It's hard to see whether or not they have done any of these things except for perhaps having some truth and documentation of what really happened. And I think we still have some questions about the uncomfortable relationship between law, justice, and morality. I think at the end of the day, as somebody who studies the law, I have real questions about the legality of Nuremberg. I don't have many questions about the morality of Nuremberg. I think Nuremberg may have been just, it was not necessarily legal. And that's all I've got, so I'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
Do you know the specific fates of like some of the top Nazi officials?
I do. Frank got death, Goering got death, Kaltenbrunner got death, Keitel and Jodl got death, Ribbentrop and Rosenberg got death. It was the guy I referred to as the Rush Limbaugh of Nazi Germany. He got acquitted. Von Papen and Schacht, who were really minor figures, they got acquitted. Donitz got 10 years, and he was essentially he was the admiral. Funk got life. Hess got life, which is Hess ended up serving the most time in prison. They put them all in a prison outside of Berlin called Spandau. And in 1987, he was the last inmate in Spandau. They were going to destroy Spandau after he died, and he ended up committing suicide at the age of 93 in 1987. Speer got 20 years, ended up writing 2 books. One included, he started writing about his life, and I guess he wrote some 2,500 pages about his life that he smuggled out, and it became a book that sold like 250,000 copies. Most of the inmates ended up not serving that many years, mostly for health reasons. A couple of them who got life ended up only serving 8 years. Goering ended up cheating the hangman. That was why there were 10 people who were hanged instead of 11. Goering had snuck he had snuck 3 cyanide capsules into the prison. One with another one was in his luggage, and another one he managed somehow, it was also in his luggage, and he managed to get a hold of it and hid it in his rectum, hid it in his toilet, and the night before they were going to be hanged, he ended up taking it, and he died. So he committed suicide. He was very upset because he had asked to be shot rather than be hanged because he felt like that was a much more honorable death. And when they said they were refusing to shoot him instead of hanging him, he committed suicide. Yeah.
Hitler and Himmler, they committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So how were they found, and what led up to that? Were like people like after them trying to find them? And
It was before the war ended, but I think Himmler was interesting. Hitler committed suicide. I mean, he knew what was coming, you know. And in the days leading up to the end of the war, I mean, the Russians were coming from one side, the British and the Americans were coming from the. He was hunkered down in his bunker with his mistress, and he committed suicide. Himmler was trying to. At the very end, Himmler created this sort of Jews for time scheme almost. He said, well, I'll let a bunch of Jews out of Auschwitz and let them go to Switzerland if you give me life instead of death at whatever tribunal ends up happening afterwards. And anybody who he mentioned it to laughed him off. I mean, he was an awful figure. And when he realized what was going to happen to him, he ended up committing suicide. There's been a lot of question. Bormann, who was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death, his body was found in 1972 near where Hitler's body was found. But up until that time, people thought that maybe he was actually alive, and there were Martin Bormann sightings everywhere, and like supposedly he was in Argentina hanging out with Eichmann. A lot of Nazi war criminals went to Argentina, but I guess they found his body, and it was actually him. So, yeah.
Have any of the laws or any of the styles of carrying out these proceedings been adopted by the UN?
Well, I mean, Nuremberg, I would say what Nuremberg has done most has been a precedent, has been a symbol. Sadly, it wasn't until the 90s that Rwanda and Bosnia ended up being the only time that there was sort of anything resembling a Nuremberg style of trial, and the world community hasn't really supported it all that much. And so the trials that were held, you know, the Clinton administration, when NATO went into Bosnia, we said, we're not hunting down war criminals, not our job. We refused to sort of fund The Hague in any way that they could really do the job well. Nuremberg was very well funded. So yes and no. I think that the idea is there, and the idea somehow the world is going to support criminal trials for acts of genocide. I haven't seen any evidence that we're particularly serious about it. We'll see what happens with the Sudan, but the discussions are that rather than that he may be indicted for what happened in Darfur, but the UN Security Council is worried because there's a very tentative peace going on there right now, and the UN Security Council can actually sort of push off international criminal tribunals for a year, and that's exactly what they're going to do. And the idea is that they worry that there's going to be a backlash. There wasn't in Germany. For whatever reason, I think the Germans had just sort of had it with the Nazis. After World War I, there was a backlash when there was talk of trying the Kaiser for what he had done for waging an aggressive war. In Bosnia, there was talk that there was going to be a backlash for the trials there. In Rwanda, there was concerns that there was going to be backlash. And so I haven't seen much evidence that Nuremberg is anything but a symbol rather than a real precedent. Yeah.
You said that the crimes on humanity, that was something that crimes against humanity was created for the trial.
Mm-hmm.
Like type of law at all that could have been used?
Essentially, it was justified. No, there was no books because there was no book. Essentially, they said there are international conventions that say this is wrong, but they don't cite any international conventions. And as far as I can tell, that's because there aren't any international conventions to cite. The best argument they make is that there are essentially that every civilized nation, murder is against the law, and that if taken together, mass murder has to be against the law. And I think that's probably the best argument you could make. And one of the reasons that the French, I sort of am very dismissive of the French, but one of the reasons didn't want any part of this is because the French legal system is statutory in nature. British and English law are based on what's called the common law system, which means as long as there's some legal precedent somewhere that you can pull off of, you can call it a law. There doesn't have to be an actual statute that's been passed. And so the French were like, there's no statute. So there's no law. This is ex post facto, end of story. The British and the Americans said, we have laws against murder. There are laws in the country against murder, regardless of whether they're murdering their own citizens or not. So that's what they use to justify it. I think it's a hard argument to make that it's not a law that you're passing after the fact, and that I think it's well justified from a moral standpoint. I think it's a tough legal argument to make, but sometimes maybe morality needs to trump law, and it's a necessary thing that you need to do. Yeah.
I think that's why they went with the war of aggression angle, push that more, because there wasn't legal
No, I think the aggressive war charge was an easier sell. I think Stimson was sort of moderately anti-Semitic. I think at the time they were writing up the charges, they hadn't seen the pictures from Dachau yet. They hadn't seen exactly what happened at Auschwitz was not known to the extent. The general public certainly didn't know it. I think it was an easier sell. I think it was also, I think there's always been this sort of notion that what the Nazis was never going to be done again. That sort of the systematic way that they went about it wasn't going to be done again, and it was more important to have a precedent on the books to stop nations from waging aggressive war than it was to stop mass murder. And I think it was a sellout of the Jews and the Gypsies, and I think Israel recognized that. Yeah.
There is a UN convention against genocide.
Now.
Which was essentially shepherded and hammered out by a Polish who emigrated to the United States by the name of Raphael Lemkin. And he personally, almost single-handedly, pushed through the United Nations Convention on Genocide. Now, whether it is applied or whether it is skirted, very often it's very difficult to define exactly what genocide is another matter. But the tribunals are ones that try crimes against humanity, but under the notion of genocide.
Which is a post-Nuremberg sort of. Yeah, I saw hands over in. Yeah.
What were the rulings for the doctors that participated in the medical experiments?
As the trials went on, it seemed like there was more and more pressure on the judges to give less and less time. And most of the judges got off with fairly light sentences. Mengele did not. I think he was hanged.
No, Mengele escaped.
Oh, he is.
Right.
Okay. But most of them got off with fairly light sentences. It was really sort of, as the trials went on, it was really the Einstock group ended up getting fairly heavy sentences. Most of them got out without serving the majority of their sentences. The industrialists got out really early, even those who got heavy sentences, mostly because the United States realized that these, the guys who ran Bayer and IG Farben and Volkswagen were necessary to rebuild the country. And so they made a political decision that it was more important that these people be allowed to help rebuild Germany than it was to have them serve prison terms for using slave labor, which is despicable, but it's the choice we made. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we're seeing any changes in the United States position on the International Criminal Court with the change in administration, or whether it's just too early to tell.
It's too early. It's hard to pin down what Obama's stance is going to be. I have a feeling it may change, but it's hard to say. And it really is. It's a difficult, I can be snarky about it and say, the United States doesn't want its own soldiers being tried for war crimes. But the United States doesn't want its own soldiers being tried for war crimes. I mean, there really is, there's sort of, I'm a realist about these things, and there is a lot of people in the world who don't like us very much. And I think that you've got to be realistic about it as a president does. And, there's an awful lot I can criticize Bush about and would. I don't know that he wasn't thinking, or the people who made the decision for him, weren't thinking rationally in telling him, don't sign on to this, it could be bad news. I don't know. It's such a hard, the definitions are difficult, body of law are difficult. It's really, any lawyer looks at the international criminal tribunals that exist and say, the body of law just isn't there to necessarily say, I'm going to absolutely give it my stamp of approval.
If there's any late justice, and it takes the form of monetary remuneration, and the German government have spent billions of dollars giving reparations, not only to victims who were former German citizens, but also to people the most recent large-scale group was people who were slave laborers. And it didn't matter if you were Jewish or not. If you were in a slave labor camp doing work for the Nazis, you can or could have, I don't know whether that call is over, you could apply for reparations. Unfortunately, many of the people who were due some of these reparations have since died. But I don't know whether you consider that justice. I don't think they do. But.
There's also been one of the other difficulties, a lot of Jews seeing the coming trouble put a lot of their wealth in Swiss bank accounts because the Swiss bank accounts were safe. The problem is that the Swiss are also very, and you get numbers, you get account numbers. Well, the account holders are the only ones who have these numbers, and most of the account holders are dead, and their heirs have not been able to get access. And there's a lawyer and law professor at NYU named Burton Neufeld, who's been very successful in suing the Swiss government to open up their files from this period in order to get some of these heirs some of their wealth back, even get heirlooms, paintings, things that were ended up putting in Swiss banks. So there have been things that have been done, and I think the Israelis have certainly been the most active in chasing Nazi war criminals, and I think in some ways they have the best legal, that their laws are not ex post facto because the crimes were actually committed against their people, at least from a legal standpoint. Yeah.
Besides the Geneva Convention, were any of the Nuremberg protocols used in the Lieutenant Callie's July trial?
Could you let them know my lab?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know enough about My Lai.
I think that they were. I think some were used.
Okay, it's not. I don't know enough about that trial, so.
Does anybody know what My Lai was?
It was a massacre committed by the Americans during the Vietnam, and there was an American lieutenant colonel. I think it was a lieutenant colonel who was put on trial, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the trial itself to know exactly what.
Because that would be a more current
Yeah.
not a current application, but
Yeah,
relative.
but not really, but not a genocide necessarily, but certainly a war
Crimes against
crimes.
humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you guys for having me.